Everyone, I am Pete Davis. I'm a 2L here at the law school and the chair of the Harvard Law Forum. It's America's longest running law school speaker series. This year we are focusing the forum right in on our school's mission statement, which is to educate leaders who contribute to the advancement of justice and the well-being of society. And in this age, justice and well-being sure as heck need some advancing. Just to if you allow me to rattle off a few reasons. A quarter of our neighbors' children grow up in poverty. Even under the advances of the 2010 healthcare law, 28 million Americans still lack health insurance. They don't talk about that much. The experience of many poor Americans with the criminal courts is 15 minutes of meet 'em, greet 'em, and plead 'em with an overstuffed public defender. 4/5 of civil legal needs go unmet. That's domestic violence victims not getting their protective orders. That's veterans not collecting their benefits, disabled children denied an education, mothers evicted from their house, and that's tens of billions of dollars in wages stolen from employees in wage theft, which is the largest property crime type in America today, a crime wave you rarely hear about in talks of law and order on Fox News. And in DC, public interest lobbyists are outgunned 34-1 by corporate interest lobbyists. And finally, well, the top 200, but not finally in reality, just finally in my talk right here. Well, the top 200 corporate interest law firms rake in $96.3 billion annually, advancing the legal interests of the top 10% of the income bracket. The entire budget for all civil legal aid for poor Americans in this country is $1.4 billion. So $96.3 billion advancing the legal interests of the wealthy, $1.4 billion for all poor folks in America. And folks aren't pitching in to help out, despite the big talk here at Harvard Law School. Corporate interest law firms, according to studies by Stanford law professor Deborah Rode, give less than half an hour a week and $50 a day to pro bono service and legal aid. There is a lot of justice left to advance. There's a lot of societal well-being that could be advanced. Our generation has a lot of work to do. And that's why today I wanted to bring someone here who is putting in that work, who is making waves, who is telling the truth about justice in America, while also doing so in the spirit of national solidarity and understanding. Heather McGhee is a leading figure in a new generation of progressive changemakers. She is a fresh face on television and in the op-ed section and in viral C-SPAN clips talking about economic and racial justice. And she is the president of Demos, a public policy organization working for an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. Before we get to Heather, I just want to point out we have on the table here afterwards Stacked Deck, a Demos report on racial bias in the big money system in politics, and the testimony of Heather about the recent Supreme Court nominees. So if you want to get deeper into this after this talk, which you will, go pick up those packets. And Heather McGhee is here to tell us about how to move beyond resistance and towards a constructive agenda that fights for and empowers working families. Let's give it up for Heather McGhee.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Pete Davis, that was great. I got your talk here. I'm going to take some of these notes. Hold on, let me turn on my mic. Great, okay. Now I can really hear myself. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm having a little bit of that feeling being back in a law school classroom. Definitely not used to being on this side. So I graduated from law school in the class of 2009 from Berkeley Law, which was fantastic. I personally really enjoyed being a law student, safe in the knowledge that I would never be a lawyer. And I'll tell you a little bit about my career path because I know that's always of interest in a second. But first, I really do want to thank Pete Davis and Brady, who've been our hosts so far today here at the law school. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank all of you for coming out on the most beautiful day of 2017 in Boston, as far as I can tell, to sit here and think and engage with me, and by extension with Demos, with the 54 people who come to work every day, guided by that mission that Pete told you about. Lawyers, economists, political scientists, campaigners, advocates, who really are, I think, showing that you can make a wonderful living helping animate the values of liberty and justice for all. And I'm very excited to share that with you all here today. So Demos, I started working at Demos when I was 22 years old. I was fresh out of undergrad at Yale, and I really wanted to work in economic policy. At that time, I did not actually know what Demos meant. Who knows what Demos means? You should never have to ask this question about the name of your public-facing organization. What does Demos mean? People. It means the people, the root word of democracy, the people of a nation. So I started working at Demos. It was sort of an obscure little think tank with about a dozen people working at it. It was founded in 2000 in this sort of baby boomlet of progressive-leaning folks who said at the end of the Clinton era, oh boy, Heritage and Cato and American Enterprise Institute have been sort of kicking our ass in the idea space and putting really big, bold, crazy policy goals out there and shifting the discourse to the right. What about, progressives? What about even the center left? And so Demos was founded then, Center for American Progress. The Roosevelt Institute was sort of reanimated. And we were founded to be an outside of the Beltway think tank. And we are headquartered in New York, even though we do have a pretty decent-sized Washington office. And there was a reason for that. There was a sense by the founders of Demos that being outside of Washington would help us dream a little bigger. That in fact, the Beltway is not just a designation of a highway ring, but it's also sort of a limit of imagination. And we had the privilege, I would say, over our last 17 years, not being in the day-to-day, hand-to-hand combat on the latest sort of atrocities in the Ryan budget, but rather being able to say what it is that we really want and need in this country for transformative change. And so it allowed us to do things like put the idea of personal debt as a major economic problem on the national agenda at a time when the credit card lobby was actually writing its own bills about how to stop people from using bankruptcy reform using bankruptcy as a last resort. It allowed us to move that issue, the issue of debt, over the course of the 2000s, from being laughed out of the halls of Congress, as I was when we first took our little report to the banking committee and said, look, credit card debt has tripled over the course of the 1990s. Shouldn't we do something about that? What about these reforms to regulate how, I can't even get through the sentence without laughing, it was so absurd at the time, to regulate how it is that lenders can treat their borrowers. So it went from being laughed out of the halls of Congress in 2002 to sitting in the Rose Garden in 2009 when the president signed our bill, which has since saved working families and borrowers $50 billion in fees alone. The credit card companies are still standing. So I love what I do, and I want to bring that more than anything to you all today. I feel very lucky. I actually discovered something when being part of the podcast that we just taped, which I think I should say more often, which is that the kind of secret formula for why it is that I love what I do is that I love the people that I work with. And I think about my friends who left law school at Berkeley and went into corporate interest law, which is a nice evolution on the term that I will start to use. And they love certain parts of their roles, but they don't necessarily love the people that they work with. And the issues that I've worked on at Demos have evolved. I came in as a person who's very focused on the economy, and then I started to recognize how much the inequality in our economy is being driven by inequality in our democracy, and have become an advocate and a thinker around issues of campaign finance reform, voting rights. I've worked on climate issues, on reproductive justice issues, but throughout it all, I've really enjoyed the people I work with inside of Demos and in the progressive movement, and that is what keeps me coming at it every day. So I just want to leave that piece of advice. Find a crew that you want to run with, and stick with them. So Demos is experiencing a moment of growth because our mission to address inequality in our economy and democracy, as it's been built in America on a scaffolding of racial and gender hierarchy, has never felt more urgent. We have been an organization leading with big, bold, progressive ideas and trying to sound the alarm about inequality for nearly a generation now. And now our core concerns are smack dab in the center of the public debate. In 2010, we decided to try to mainstream, just as we did the idea of credit card regulation, try to mainstream the idea of refunding public higher education so that it would be debt-free for all students. And we put out this kind of audacious goal back in 2010 and said, you know what? I know that right now in Washington, Democrats are just cutting a deal to sort of shave a point or two off of the interest rates of federal student loans, but we think that by 2016 in the presidential race, there's going to be a robust debate about student debt. It's going to be one of the top issues, and all the Democrats, at least, are going to be for debt-free college, really refunding the system, getting rid of student debt altogether as a price of entry for the middle class. That was crazy when we adopted that goal. We had it on this flow chart, and people apparently, they didn't tell me at the time, but they thought it was a little bit silly to put that audacious goal out there. And it ended up happening. I think we are seeing a rate of change in the political debate that a generation ago would have taken 5-10 years at a time. Ideas are coming in, bad ideas and good ideas, and getting an airing. We're at a moment of a massive emerging political audience. And so the latent problems, and I would say that they are many, the basic things that keep working families up at night, whether it's how to hold on to the job that you have, how to save for retirement when defined benefit pensions have been replaced by insecure 401ks, how to hold on to your health care as you move from job to job, how to afford to live in a place where there are jobs, how to afford to get to work in a place where there isn't mass transit, how to afford childcare. Who you actually go to when you have these problems in your life. How distant or close do you feel from the people who are holding the pen, writing the rules that shape economic opportunity for your community? What are we going to do about the melting planet? How is it that I can get a speeding ticket that will create a cascade of problems in my life that may result in me losing my kids and my job, and nobody seems to care? How is it that I would have to drive 5 hours to see a healthcare provider who's willing to give me the full range of services that I need? These are overdue questions. For too long, and I would say for most of us, I'm getting a sort of eyeball read of people's relative ages. I would say that for my generation, I'm kind of a millennial grandmother, having been born in the first year of the millennial generation. Government has felt neglectful at best and abusive at worst in many of our communities. And yet, our generation is the largest, most diverse, most progressive and active and educated generation in American history. And we have pretty high expectations for the level of problems that we want to solve and for our own ability to actually engage in those solutions. And this is the time when we have to flood the zone. Political actors How many of you have ever worked on a campaign or worked in government? Wow, that's amazing. That's great. That's a lot higher share than is usually in a room, even a room like this. In general, after you worked on that campaign or worked in government, did you feel more or less optimistic and inspired about the potential for common solutions to our common problems? Raise your hand if you were more inspired. Okay, less? Now, the more people, did you work on the Obama campaign? Because that's an anomaly. I asked that question because I think it's really important, as I said, that we flood the zone, that we don't leave, as too often has happened, the level of contesting for governing power to people who are not the same people who would do grassroots organizing and social justice law and practice. There's actually been a divide. It's happened for pretty specific traceable reasons. There was a philosophy, an Alinsky philosophy of community organizing that eschewed electoral politics. And then we also have a tax code that says that you can do a ton in the 501c3 space, but you have to limit your lobbying and you can't endorse candidates. And so the organizations and people, often from social workers to public interest lawyers who have the strongest progressive values and are the most connected to communities that are in need, are not in the halls of power, are not running themselves for office, are not endorsing candidates and speaking out and trying to shape who gets to run and who gets to win. Then, of course, we have our campaign finance system, which I talked about at length a couple of weeks ago when I testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee against Neil Gorsuch, completely on money and politics grounds. We have a long-term plan at Demos to overturn not only Citizens United, but Buckley v. Vallejo, and put forward an alternative rationale under the Constitution for supporting democracy reforms. Even though we have that, another big audacious goal, we also know that there's a ton that can be done today to reform our campaign finance system, and there's a particular reform that I hope is on your radars because it can be transformational in your own careers and work, and that's small donor-matched public financing, which we have in New York City. We helped get on the ballot and win in Seattle, and is in a number of other states, including Maine and Arizona. Levels of robustness of the system differ. But the basic idea is that someone who only has friends who could write a $100 check would have that check matched 5 to 1, 6 to 1 by public money. And so it just changes who can be competitive. It changes who can run. Because right now in the Senate, half of them are millionaires. Of course they are. People have to raise $3,000 a day to be competitive. And that's an old number from before this past election. So I'm really inspired in this moment by the unbelievable record-breaking public engagement that we've had since the day after the inauguration of the biggest protest in history, to my friends who work on the Hill who say that their relationship to their phone has just changed completely. That offices are tracking who's calling, and it's 3 times more phone calls on a weekly basis than they've ever had before. That everyone from my hairdresser to my sister-in-law is asking what they can do, and that the only limit is our imagination about what we can possibly demand, both in this moment of resistance and, more importantly, as far as I'm concerned and as far as Demos is concerned, the moment of opportunity when the opposition becomes not the forces in exile, but those who are saying, it's our turn, we can do something better. I'm really eager to get to questions, but I'll just close with this idea. At Demos, we really believed that because in part of those unanswered questions that I laid out, neither party has been able to really offer themselves as the solution to what keeps working families up at night. Neither party has been able to contend with the scale of challenges and elite policy failures that have been the markers of American society, from the Iraq War to Hurricane Katrina to the financial crash to our inability to lead on climate change. And yet, the amount of political consciousness, racial consciousness, emerging class consciousness is a reason for real optimism in this place where we experiment with self-government, where the demos of a nation has to be awake, has to be alive and engaged, or else this will continue to be a plutocracy. We have always had in this country a tension between our plutocratic instincts, structures, and history, and the promise of real self-governance by an increasingly diverse demos. That is the fight. It's kind of always been the fight. And when there is cross-racial solidarity, when there is organizing, when there is hope on the ground, we move forward. When working class people and middle class people are pitted against each other by race, as we so deeply are right now, we stall. And that, for me, is the reason why, even though I would never wish the election outcomes personally on this country, I think we're already seeing the damage that it is doing to our country, to our communities, to our place in the world, to the psychology of children who are growing up in this moment with all of this vitriol. My piece of silver lining is that this is a moment of widespread resistance and consciousness raising without which we can never advance. This is not a self-actualizing system we have in the United States. Democracy is and needs to be something that we all practice, that we all take as not only our right, but our responsibility. And I do think that those of us who have been given the keys to the kingdom, as those of us who have a legal education have been, we know the rules and principles that are operational for everyone who walks through this country. But we are part of the small sliver of folks who know what they are. We have a really heavy responsibility to be a part of educating the public, of working alongside the public, of leading and moving towards a more perfect union and a democracy that this people, this beautiful, ever-changing American people, really deserves. Thank you. My hype man. I'm going to bring you with me everywhere, please.
So, we're going to open it up for questions. I'm going to start with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to everyone. So, first question is: we titled this talk "Beyond Resistance," and it's coming from an essay you wrote in February about how, after the election, everyone was talking, we got to resist Trump. We're the resistance. And you were saying we need to also have a constructive program as well. So could you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so I read an article in February that, so I've been thinking about it, we've been thinking about it at Demos as being the opposition, right? Because when you're actually saying we want to replace the forces in power, you're not just resistance, you're opposition, right? But having a visionary opposition. So here's a very concrete example. In everything that those who are resisting and opposing the Trump administration, in every move, we think it's important to also say not just what we're against, but what we're for. Because the status quo is not what we're fighting for. And that's the difficult place that we're in right now. It was very vivid in the healthcare debate, where you had, rightly, a massive, surprising movement across the country of people resisting changes to the Affordable Care Act that would have taken away healthcare, over the next decade for 24 million people. That would have whittled down benefits to where healthcare was really unrecognizable. But at the same time, as Pete reminded us, there are still tens of millions of people who have no health insurance whatsoever, and people who have health insurance that's not meeting their needs. And so the cry and the claim was, don't repeal the Affordable Care Act. And that, in the end, ended up being successful. But that just leaves us with the status quo. And so we felt that it was important at the same time as opposing Trump Care, as we oppose Trump Care, to also say, move the ball forward on what was needed, on government negotiation of drug prices, right? Prescription drug prices are still massive pain points for, frankly, an over-medicated society, but one thing at a time. You've got healthcare exchanges across the country where insurers are deciding to leave, private insurers are deciding to leave. If we had a public option in every exchange, that wouldn't result in, less choice for folks in those states. Senator Sanders introduced Medicare for All right after and did a push for that right after the bill was withdrawn in the House. And oddly enough, Representative Conyers' bill on Medicare for All has over 100 co-signers. Focus groups that Sarah Cliff at Vox did with Trump supporters showed that half of them wanted single payer. They didn't necessarily call it single payer, but they said we should have it like the Canadian system, everyone gets the same thing, you just pay taxes, and government pays the doctors. So, we can't stay still. We can't be, as progressives, for Demos, we feel like we can't be the champion of the status quo, because the status quo isn't good enough. And the status quo isn't good enough, particularly for exactly the people who are supposed to be the progressive base. Economically struggling families of all races, single women, people of color, young people, immigrants. That is exactly who are the folks who can't pay a $400 bill without going into debt or selling something, which applies to half of American families. And so we think that it's easy for the overreach and the meanness, frankly, of the right wing right now to make Americans be turned off. But that doesn't mean that they're going to choose and love a progressive vision if it's not up to the task of answering the big questions that are keeping folks up at night.
Thank you for that. One final question for me, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. Is one of my goals at the school is to have 51% of graduates go to work for organizations predominantly designed to serve the bottom 90% of the income bracket. And so a majority of Harvard Law School, you'd say a majority of Harvard Law School is going on to serve the demos. And right now the number is only 20%, so it's a reach goal.
I like audacious goals.
And part of the reason I think it's that low is because people believe that if they went into these organizations, they can't change the world. I overheard a conversation at lunch once where someone said, I came to law school thinking I could make a difference. I learned we all can't be Abraham Lincoln or something. It was or we're all not going to be saints. And so I'd love to hear, you started in 2002 as a 22-year-old. 7 years later, you're in the Rose Garden passing a bill that you've been working on. So tell us about the kind of how you can make a difference.
These are boom times. I mean, in some ways there's kind of no excuse other than financial, and we can talk about ways to get around that, not to go into social change right now. It is the most exciting time, I think, to be doing that work. When I started working at Demos in 2002, it was toiling in obscurity. It was talking about inequality at a time that even Democrats were talking about inequality. we would like run around the office with a newspaper saying we're relevant whenever one of our issues was even covered, much less with our name on it or our research quoted. I mean, I had to do like massive translation between my life and the wonky world that I lived in and any of my friends and my family, right? That is not the case today. And there are new organizations starting all the time, and it is yet to be determined whether or not they will become sort of enduring infrastructure, but your efforts can make that difference. As well as, Demos is hiring every year. We're growing more people, and organizations like ours. So I think there is opportunity in social change work. I think that there is, we have a dozen lawyers on our staff. And over the probably 13 years that we've had litigators on staff, their role has changed and evolved. They are more likely now to be in the room at a meeting with issue campaigners who are thinking about the strategy to try to get paid family leave passed in Albany, and are less likely to be just in a room with lawyers thinking about designing litigation and then sort of grabbing a community group as a plaintiff at the at the end. And then in terms of your question about change and how fast it can happen and how satisfying that might be, I think that we are at an incredibly volatile political moment where at Demos we think about the arc and the life cycle of an idea. And we identify where, for example, the idea sits on a range of, I'm not going to on the range of, getting a little carried away here in a classroom, on a range of stakeholders and how they situate the problem and how much of a sort of, how heightened the problem is. For example, I'll use the example of student debt and affordable college. When we first started working on it, we mapped out the stakeholders or people from university presidents to affected families to, business executives, policymakers at different political stripes. Do they think it's a problem? Do they think student debt is a problem? How much of a problem? How urgent is it for them? Do they think it's a problem the way we think it's a problem, which is a problem of state disinvestment? 26 cents on the dollar per pupil on average has been cut over our lifetimes from state college? Or do they think it's a problem of like runaway teachers unions or fancy buildings? Where does the problem live for them? And then do those same set of policies, stakeholders, think about our solution, debt-free public college? Is it on their radar? Do they think it's feasible? Do they think it's crazy? Right now, most of the problems that are in the progressive orbit are pretty high of attention and sense of urgency among a lot of the stakeholders. That is wonderful for making change. The degree of the degree normally in any given state legislative cycle of kind of what a legislator or legislative aide would see as apathy, the fact that they never get any calls or any letters about the issues that are coming before them, except for from the lobbyists. It only takes, at a state legislative level, it only takes a meeting with 15 people to get notice from a state legislator or an assembly person, right? This has never happened before, right? I'm used to seeing the 5 public interest lobbyists and the 25 corporate interest lobbyists, and that's it. Constituents don't come to ask me about public transit. So we're at a time when I think that the level of attention to the problem is high enough that you can organize quite quickly. And I would say, as a just small piece of advice about sort of how to, if you're engaging in resistance work, how to feel a sense of efficacy. It does matter. It does matter to what can happen in Congress, as we have seen. It does matter, frankly, I think, to how muscular the response is going to be from judges. I don't think we would have seen the Muslim ban go down in as many places if it hadn't been for 5 million people in the streets the day after. because of how much deference courts usually give executives on issues like that. But finding a local issue where you can actually show progress on some of the values that are animating people at the national level, you can make a massive amount of difference in one state legislative cycle with the number of people who are, joining Indivisible Cambridge, bringing them to a state legislative office to talk about how we can help working families here at home in Massachusetts. It's a game-changing moment. So I believe that we are actually at a time when you can have some pretty big quantum leaps of progress because of how much civic participation is there and how much awareness there is of the problems.
Let's open it up to questions. Anyone have questions?
Hi, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I've heard you speak a couple of times, so it's awesome to hear you speaking here at the law school. My question is specifically about promoting the ideas, promoting the work that you do, and getting to the point that something is being signed by the president or having those massive changes. Groups like Heritage have like the Heritage Action for America, and it gets a lot of money. They're able to do a lot with that. And I don't know if Demos has something similar or what exactly is the nature of your political action.
Great question. So Demos has Demos Action. We do have a C4. It's probably like 6% of the budget of Heritage Action, but it's all right. It's okay. So here are the tools that we use. I'm going to take debt-free college, for example. Right? So we first started working on it. We felt like the issue was framed terribly in media coverage and in the minds of legislators and in the minds of families, like everybody. It was kind of a disaster when you look on that kind of stakeholder map we talked about. So we spent 3 years relentlessly releasing research and doing briefings to raise people's awareness in the media, the journalists that are supposed to be covering higher ed, etc., of the cuts at the state level to public funding for higher education, which is the major driver of the increase in tuition and therefore student debt. So we had to we did lots of briefings of journalists. We had to get the problem well framed so that the solution of what we ended up designing as a sort of state-federal partnership to cover the cost of instruction with public dollars again would seem like the right solution as opposed to MOOCs or something, right? If you don't have the problems framed right, then any solution might do. That was not political work, right? That was some lobbying, but don't need to get totally in the weeds, but you can do a fair amount of lobbying under your 501c3. It was research, it was communications work, it was organizing and stakeholder gatherings, it was going to state legislators and states where you maybe wouldn't expect it, where there were a few legislators who wanted to make this an issue. It was giving talking points to legislators. It was being sort of available in the ideas space. Then I will say that it did not become, it sort of got turbocharged when a partner organization named the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, PCCC, which is actually a PAC, not a super PAC, just a regular PAC, wanted to find a bunch of big ideas that they could put in front of congressional candidates before the 2016 election cycle. So they came to Demos as a big idea shop, and we gave them a whole bunch of big ideas, including debt-free college. They polled it. They polled it with the people who had voted in 2012, but not in the midterm elections in 2014. So this is drop-off midterm Obama voters for the most part, and said which of these issues, if this had been kind of what was at stake in the campaign, would have gotten you out. And debt-free college was the number one. So that then they had an argument to make about the political salience of this issue to then political actors, which was a step that we had not yet taken. So then they started, they know who's potentially going to be a congressional candidate, and they do a lot of outreach and work to people who are putting their hat in to run, and so they started briefing them on debt-free college. We briefed all of the, using our C4, 501c4 Demos Action, we briefed all of the presidential candidates, O'Malley, Clinton, and Sanders, and every one of them had some version of free college. But yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking more about this idea that I'll talk about this year specifically, but yeah, that American classism kind of really divides and strengthens racism.
Mm-hmm.
And that you can see this in, I think, kind of a number of instances. You can look at it and really the hate of the welfare state is fueled by anti-black racism and the welfare state. The prison industrial complex, similarly, fueled by, anti-black racism and kind of how that emerged. So in this instance, and we've had like socialist policies, more socialist policies in the past.
Yeah. When
there's huge, we're in a time where wealth inequality, at a peak. And when we get that peak, there's kind of enough disempowered folks to create the silver lining that you're talking about, where there's potential for action. But I'm coming more to the conclusion that it's not centered, if racism is not centered, not wealth inequality, that these patterns just reemerge. And I think there's a huge reluctance to center racism. Even, there's a huge reluctance to center racism. So just in kind of your work, you can speak to that idea, speak to that reluctance. And then the last thing is that Derek Bell, there's something I've been wrestling with and trying to, I don't know if I agree or not, but I think there's a lot of evidence and support. That he makes the claim that black people will never gain full equality in this country. That this is a hard to accept fact that all history verifies, and that we must acknowledge it and move on. We must acknowledge the permanence of our subordinate status. And I think there's a lot of support for that, but that's a position that very few people take, and they kind of operate on the premise that this convergence will happen with maybe some of these involved in, the college fund and whatnot, and other kind of policies, when the evidence doesn't necessarily support it. So I'm just, if you can, with the like 50 things that's true.
No, those are the things. Those are what we play with. So I couldn't actually agree with you more on the first part. Derek Bell, whose widow, is actually on our board. We have lots of conversations about that last piece. But let me take the first piece for a minute. So my colleague Ian Haney-Lopez, who was my con law professor at Bolt and then has since become a Demos Senior Fellow, he and I wrote a piece for The Nation last winter called How Economic Populists Like Bernie Sanders Should Talk About Racism. And it was a response to a Democratic primary in which you had, this like grade class guy and this like, maybe come lately, but like identity woman at odds. And the sort of class left and the race identity left was, duking it out in chat rooms across the internet about whether or not race was a function of the class divide. Bernie Sanders' kind of story about racism was this big problem we have of economic inequality, and people of color are hurt more. And so if we fix economic inequality, people of color will be disproportionately helped. And then you had a person who was talking about identity and diversity and discrimination, but was not talking about the class war as much. So it's our firm belief, and in fact it's pretty central to something that I did when I took over as president of Demos 3 years ago, which was create a racial equity organizational transformation process for the organization, where over the past 3 years, everyone from our accounts payable person to our economists have been undergoing workshops and trainings and personal development around issues of race and identity and how they affect our work. It's our fundamental belief at Demos that class has always been racially construed in the United States, that we would be a much more economically progressive country if it weren't for the weapon that race has been in the class war. When Bernie talked about like Denmark all the time, I was like, dude, we're not Denmark. We're never gonna be Denmark as long as we're this diverse. You can't have an economic democracy without a demos, right? Without a sense of social coherence and equality and basic belief in the humanity and dignity of everybody in your demos. And the right wing has known that, and for the past 50 years has been very explicit about the centrality of racial division as their political weapon. The majority of white voters have not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act. If you listen today to Fox News and right-wing media or the president, you would have a terrible view of people of color and immigrants. And you would link that view to your understanding of the social welfare state, the very idea of government, the very idea of any public institutions, including labor unions, when part of the public is degraded and suspicious, lazy at best, criminal at worst. So, to the reluctance, I'm going to just be very real. White progressives, generally speaking, are reluctant to foreground race. And for me, leading an organization that was majority white when I took over, and it was still predominantly white, I had to really kind of get under the skin of that and understand why, because it's not like, particularly those folks at Demos who are really working in progressive politics, didn't understand what I just said about race being used as a weapon in the class war. Like that was not news to them. But we have an outdated idea of what racism is, that it's an individual evil and an individual sin. And so people who have organized their lives, possibly like against social pressure and family training, to be good people, which are all the people who are, progressive white folks, for whatever their issue, like you're animating your life around the idea of being, of doing good and being good, which is great. The I think outmoded paradigm of racism as an individual sin makes it difficult to acknowledge how pervasive it is. Because we have this idea of the evil racists from history, but they're grandparents, right? I think it's one of our major conceptual flaws that we assume that people, ordinary people, were either sort of more evil before, right, in the era of Jim Crow, which allows people to think that ordinary people today are not as racist. And I think that racism is the air that we breathe in this country. And of course it is. 80% of the gross domestic product at the eve of the Civil War was from slave labor and linked to it. Like, the formation of our capitalism is a formation of our government structures. All of our, major sort of governing laws and principles were made at a time when white supremacy was the overriding and explicit goal. So how could it not be? And we're such a young country. I think we need to move past the denial phase and then get to work. Some of you may have seen the sort of viral video that happened when a white guy from North Carolina called into C-SPAN when I was on and said, I'm a white male and I'm prejudiced. And I want to change. And I want to become a better American. And I'm hoping your guest, you didn't really know my name, can help. And I responded with empathy because I was like, hallelujah, at least he's admitting it. Donald Trump says he doesn't have a racist bone in his body. Yeah. Now we can get to work, And so at Demos, we really believe that candidates, and we're starting this work now, need to, particularly white progressive candidates, of which there are going to be, even more now, right? I mean, the kind of like Bernie revolution is ongoing at the state and local and congressional level. There are going to be a lot of white candidates who are going to have a perfect story on class. But if they don't foreground, as you say, racism, and not just the disparity story of racism, not just, when people of color are hurt more, but actually racism as a strategic weapon in politics that in fact impacts us all. that degrades all of our public systems, then first of all, they're not going to be able to create a multiracial coalition because people of color are going to be like, you really care about class, like we're a tag on. And you're not going to be able to move white voters to start hearing the dog whistles, to start being allergic to the race baiting and recognizing that not only is it bad for people of color, but it's bad for them too, in their own economic interests.
Thanks so much for all those questions. This is the final Harvard Law Forum of the year. In the fall, we have Noam Chomsky, Helen Prejean, and many more coming along. And I couldn't have asked for a better final speaker of this year's. Young people, especially those in the room.
Get through your exams. I understand where the pressure is right now, but do good. It's rewarding financially, spiritually, socially. Do good.
Amen to that.